Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Fine, professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University, and this is Crisis and Hope YU Voices. YU Voices is a forum for all sorts of conversations relating to the YU community, our current situation as a culture, and the biggest part of the world we can think about. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Richard Hidary of Yeshiva University and Professor Michal Siegal of the Ben-Gurion University of the Desert. I got the title right. They're going to talk about their wonderful books in a session called Appreciating the Bavli in the Context of Christian Sources and Classical Rhetoric, a Public Dialogue. I'm so excited. Welcome to you both. We're on. You're on.
Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you, Stephen. It's really nice to see students and teachers, colleagues all together here, and I'm very excited that Michal was able to join us from Israel. I guess that means we owe you a plane ticket, but
you do. You do.
You're here now. Michal is a close friend. We met at a conference 13 years ago, and has really been very helpful to me and to the whole field. So Michal specializes in Jewish-Christian relations in the time of the Talmud. And she's written 2 books about that, which we will discuss today. But I do want to also say that Michal is really a leader in the field. She's the kind of person that brings people together that need to be in conversation with each other, that spearheads, conferences and just really is a kind of encouraging voice, making sure that the field is going in the right direction. So we need both great scholars and great leaders and friends like yourself. So I'm very, very happy that you joined us today.
That was very nice introduction. Thank you for that. And I just want to say one thing that I promised in my Facebook feed, that today we're going to talk about bunk beds too. So I need to say that every time I visit Ricky's house, and a few times when he lived in a smaller than usual house, I bunk bed with his kids. So that just shows how close of a friend he is and how amazing this friendship has been. And I think very conducive also to research. So that's a good, I like your introduction because it shows how friendship is a good part of good research.
Thank you, Michal. So, in that spirit, before we get to the content of our books, I'd like for my students and everybody here to know a little bit more about you, and ask you, when did you decide to become a Talmud scholar? What was your motivation, and what was your experience that brought you to where you are today?
The truth is, my motivation was denial of access. I grew up in a religious environment where I went to all religious girls school, where I wasn't allowed access to the Talmud. It's not exactly true, because I did have access to the content, but through mediators. We had people explain to us what the halacha says and what we need to do, but never direct access to the sources. And I guess if you deny someone long enough something that looks interesting, that at least for me, that was incentive to go do that when I was 19. I finished high school when I was 17, so I went when I was after 3 years of civil service. I decided to dedicate a year and went to Linden Bounds for a year and started studying Talmud. And I have to tell you, it was very hard to begin from scratch. And I fell in love. It was as simple as that. After the hard beginning, and I really felt that this was so much fun. my Judaism became so much richer and multi-layered and intriguing, and not at all what I thought and what I was made to believe that my religion was based on. And this is how I just, after a few months, decided that this is what I want to do, to the chagrin of my parents, who really, really wanted me to be a doctor. I have to say that when I graduated from Yale, my father, who's a doctor who I love dearly, said, well, I guess you're not going to be a doctor after all. So it took him that long to realize that.
But you did become a doctor.
I did. It doesn't
not the
count.
kind that helps people.
Doesn't count. No, doesn't count. And so, yeah, so that was it. I really I have to say, the sources made me, I did not think about a career. I did not think about, how I'm going to make money off of it. But I just, read the sources and said, that's what I want to do. It was as simple as that. Love at first sight. Ricky, what made you decide to be a Talmud scholar?
Well, glad you asked. So I guess I have, in some ways similar, in some ways different. I studied Gemara since elementary school, well, middle school, and then high school. It was one of my favorite classes in high school. And I had a great teacher, Rabbi Raymond Harari. And then I loved it so much, even outside of school, I had a chavruta and would, go and study with him and develop those skills. And then studying in Yeshiva Har Etzion and in YU, with so many great teachers that taught me a lot of different perspectives and different skills and methodologies, and I gained from all of them. And then other teachers here in my community, more of a Sephardic style, and I loved it, but I still felt like there was other aspects of Talmud that was missing. One thing about the Talmud is that it's not just reading a book. You enter into it. You're not passive. You can't understand it unless you're really inside the conversation. And I guess I wanted more direct access to know the rabbis better and who they were. So one course I took in the Herzog College while I was at Yeshiva Har Etzion, which was more of an academic bent. And by Professor Abraham Wolfish. And I said, this is really interesting question. I remember having conversations, and tell me about the rabbis and who they were. And then as an undergrad, taking a class with Professor Elman, alav shalom. And then remember he would talk about Rava, the fourth generation, where he lived and what he did, and like he knew him like a friend, like he could meet Rava in the street and start a conversation. And so that's something that really drew my attention. And then when Jeffrey Rubenstein's first book came out, Talmudic Stories, I read that and said, oh, this is, I feel like he was able to put together both the history and the literary reading of the stories of the Talmud that made them more alive and relevant and interesting than I'd ever seen before. So as at that point, I decided to go and study with him and enter this career. And I'm really appreciative that I was able to bring together both the yeshiva background and academic background, because I think the Talmud is so rich that you really need all the tools that you can get in order to delve into the depths of its meaning.
Such a great segue to my next question. I wanted to ask you really specifically, if you want to talk about tools, what made you, if you have to refine that question, what makes a good Talmud scholar, or you specifically, into a greater scholar that's not made of academic background, not the degree you do, not the professor you study, what outside of academia makes a good Talmud scholar?
I think it's attention to detail. And I'm thinking of other things besides Talmud that kind of inform the way I approach it. So
I just have to stop you and said I suggested to Ricky to ask himself if his ballet classes was any helpful, but he said no.
So I never took ballet classes, but something related to music, which is that since a kid I play cello. I haven't played in the past few years because my brother borrowed my cello and broke it. But I played, pretty seriously in high school and college.
Wait, which brother?
I won't say. And in college, I played in the chamber music group, and it was one of the most fun things I ever did. So if anybody knows anything about cello, the classic thing that everybody loves to play, the most popular, are Bach's cello suites. Six suites for cello solo. So when I was studying them, there's a lot of different versions out there, and you can listen to Yo-Yo Ma and Casals and so many different interpretations of it. But I wanted to know what was the original? What did Bach really want to know? I think I always had that sense. So one day I went and I picked up this book, which is the original manuscript of the cello suites. So Bach did not write anything himself. We don't have any manuscripts of his own handwriting, but all of his music was transcribed by his second wife Anna Magdalena. And so this is, the actual manuscript from that she wrote with her markings and all of that. And so this Russian cellist, Kurtz, transcribed it. And, when you look back, so I would go back and look at this and try to look at the original markings and what did they mean, when the bow stroke, do you, when do you change directions? Do you have many notes in one bow stroke or change it? And the fingerings and the tempo, right? All these little details that maybe you don't notice when you're just listening, but make a big difference when you're actually trying to play it. And so I would, analyze these, and sometimes she made mistakes. She was kind of careless as a scribe. And so now the editor has to figure out, okay, this is just a mistake, or maybe it's just a weird interpretation. After all, in those days, they had cellos with 5 strings, and we only have 4 strings. And now we have to figure out how it applies to the modern day situation. So in those days, in the 18th century, performers were expected to improvise, to bring a little of their own. But the writer here says, but nowadays we're not in the 18th century, and I want to know exactly what Bach meant and played exactly as he said. So this, I think, reminds me a lot of Talmud, because Talmud originally was Torah Shebe'al Peh. It was something that you hear. It was a performance that the audience would listen to the shiur of the rabbi in some ancient Bet Midrash or Bet Knesset. And maybe it was different every time. And so now we are left with the notes and the short snippets of laws and discussions that we have in the Talmud, trying to recreate what that experience was like. And so what does that mean? Are we trying to get back at the original thought of the author? Are we trying to make a performance ourselves? And we're all performers also as we teach Torah, as we teach our classes. And thinking about the strict, rigid letter of the text, places where scribes make mistakes, and hopefully bring together all those little details that seem like, oh, it's just a little manuscript, but that when you put them together, hopefully it makes a beautiful piece. So I think this is one of the non-academic background things, aspects of background that it has informed my methodology. But I'd love to
say it's a better answer than ballet classes. Good answer.
I'd love to ask you the same question.
I actually have a very similar answer with the different details. I also think that attention to details is what makes a good scholar. I agree completely. For me, it wasn't about music. It came from Agatha Christie. When I was 10, my grandmother, who was a philologist herself, she was a scholar of philo, she gave me my first Agatha Christie book. And she said, it's a well-kept secret that us European scholars, we love to, we have, our low time, our, fun, non-academic times. And what I do in my time is Agatha Christie. And it was a little bit like a secret, that because a respectable, scholar should not read detective works. And it was, how I said my first love was Talmud. The truth is my first love was Agatha Christie, and with all the attention to details. And I read every single Agatha Christie volume that was around. And I think there's something very similar about what I choose to do when I study Talmud and I look for details, and I look for clues for Jewish-Christian interaction, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I try to see what the Talmud is not telling us, or telling us, but telling us in a different way than we might expect. And that's so Agatha Christie, as opposed to Sherlock Holmes, for example, which my grandmother despised. She was a great feminist, and she thought that Hercule Poirot was stupid, but Miss Marple was amazing. That's how I grew up. And she said about Sherlock Holmes that he has the details, but he only reveals them at the end. You don't know what he sees, right? He tells you at the end, I knew because so and so, and then he tells you how he knew, as opposed to Agatha Christie that lays all the clues right there for you to see, and you can decipher, who killed, who murdered, and by the end, after you read a few novels, if you're good enough, you get to do that, and the sense of achievement is amazing. And I kind of feel a little bit like that with the Talmud. But the reward is sometimes even better than that, because you really get to decipher something that the original authors meant, was lost for centuries, and then you get to reconnect with what they were trying to do, which is an amazing feeling, right? So, for example, I look for Jewish-Christian interactions. I try to say that the rabbis knew about Christian traditions of their time, literary traditions, and they used them when they created certain traditions in the Talmud. Those were kind of lost over the years, and readers of them from medieval times and modern times for sure, but really very close to the transmission of the Talmud, already those meanings were lost. And then we get to, with the tools that we get today, the tools that the academy today and critical tools give us, we get to decipher what they meant. We get to be the detectives that you know, the Hercule Poirot of the world, or Miss Marple of the world, that gets to see what they meant to transfer, what they knew, and really reconstruct history. And that's something I get goosebumps just talking about this, because the process is so much fun. And so, you know, those downtime, those fun times that my grandmother talked about, I get to do this for work, for a living. So for me, this was it. And I have to say that on the side, that another non-academic inspiration for what I do as a scholar is my grandmother herself, meaning seeing her do her philological work was something that really made me, I think, who I am. I have to say, I always tell that story. When she was dying, she was diagnosed with cancer and she died very fast, but I was already in the States studying Syriac at Harvard, and I got a phone call that I need to rush back to Israel, which I did. And I sat by her bed, and at the time I was writing my master thesis, and I was writing about the tithe in the Mechilta Ledvarim, in the lost Mechilta Ledvarim. And I was dealing with little details of tithe and whatever. So she removes her mask and she says, so tell me what you're doing. And she puts the oxygen mask. She died really a few days later. And I tell her what I'm doing. So she removes it. She said, really, you couldn't choose a, you know, more interesting topic? And she puts it back on. And I said to her, really, you're the one to talk? Because her dissertation was all about the sacrificial terms in the Septuagint, something the most, like, you know, remote, exotic, super philological, boring topic. And then she removes the mask and she laughs heartily, and and this is one of the last conversation I had with her. So I have to say, seeing her doing that, and remember, she did this, you know, between, you know, after Second World War, she was a professor. I'm a third generation of female professor. I don't think there's a lot of people who can say that. My mom is a professor as well. And there's something that about those two women in my life that I saw them work hard on academic achievement. And I think really, I don't know if you would call this academic or personal or role model, but this is for me something that really, I think, helped make me what I am today. So that's my answer to that one.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And you talked about mystery, and certainly I think everyone here, you know, senses that studying Talmud is like you have to be a detective to, you know, to figure out what's going on. Sometimes the biggest mystery is one that you don't even know that there's a case there, and you actually have to find the question. And so that leads to my next question is, you know, sometimes there are well-known questions that everybody's asking, and so you can add to that. But sometimes there's something there that no one would even notice is an issue that's important to discover. And I think that applies to a lot of your work, because you show that there's a number of dialogues in the Talmud that don't talk about Christians. They don't mention anything about it, and no one would ever think that it has anything significant. It just seems like there'll be a little dialogue between a rabbi and some heretic. So my next question is, what made you think of the topic of your book? Like, you know, what was a spark that said, this is something that's an important topic that I want to devote a few years to, right? How did you come to your idea?
That's a very good question, because really my first book that dealt with Jewish-Christian interaction, but between monastic literature of the monks, of the Christian monks, and the Babylonian Talmud, is really what you described, meaning that you read a story about a rabbi in a cave, Rashbi in a cave, and it signals nothing Christian in the story. And unless you read monastic stories parallel to that stories, you don't even know that it's Christian. So What made me do this? I think I'm really, I'm a product of my time. I'm the zeitgeist of my time. And I owe this to Yale University. I came from Hebrew and I was about to start my PhD there. I had a topic already and I was beginning to start. And then I was sitting at Harvard at the time and I said, I'm about to write about rabbinic literature. And the truth is, I'm ashamed to say, but I know very little. My training had prepared me very little to know anything about the non-Jewish world of the time of the rabbis. I knew very, very little. And then I had a conversation with someone who's here in the crowd, my mentor, my someone that I look up to, Professor Stephen Fraud. And I came up to Yale to meet with him. And I said that to him, and I ended up writing a Yale, and that's thanks to him, my PhD. And the truth is, the fact that Jewish studies at Yale, as opposed to Hebrew, where I studied, is located within the Department of Religious Studies, made me open the books on the time. I remember myself opening the syllabus and looking at the course selection and doing 2nd to 6th century, everything not Jewish, and just gobbling up courses. I took like 12 courses in one semester and just doing everything non-Jewish. And I have to tell you, at the end of the first semester, I had 7 topics for a dissertation that I could choose from, because there's so much to be done in that area. But I really am a product of the Yale training of looking at the Talmud in relation to other, and I'm very, very fortunate to have been able to do that, to travel to Yale and to study from that topic. Specifically about my second book, which is the one that we're talking about today, the one that came out last year. This book is about minim stories, heretic stories in the Babylonian Talmud. And the reason that I decided to write about this specific topic within Jewish-Christian relation is about the fact that when I was doing this monastic stories, my conclusion was that there's a lot of similarities between Jewish and monastic, the Talmud and monastic sources, and they knew the sources and they corresponded and they're dialoguing with it and they accepted a lot of the premises that were around. And I kept getting answers like, oh, that's very interesting, and you're the first person to do that. Well, what about polemics? What about polemics? And I said, I'm trying to push for a non-polemic view. They said, okay, that's great, that's wonderful. But what about the polemics and what about the minim? And I said, you know what? I need to do the minim. And then it actually connected to something much earlier in my life, which is a little bit romantic also, because on my date with someone that became my husband, Elitzur, one of our first dates was actually when we were dating on Shavuot Eve. And like very frum couples, we sat and studied together, and we actually studied Tractate Brachot at the time, and came upon a story which I'll introduce later on. That's my example for today, about Bulia, and that's one of the chapters in my book. And we kind of got to talking about maybe Christian background. I was 19 at the time. We got married a few months later, and I kind of left it aside. And then really, we've been married for 21 years. So about 18 years later, when our son was born, Yahav, so he's my third child, and we have twins. And when the twins were born, life after they were born were just so hectic, and I'm finishing my dissertation and raising twins, blah, blah, blah. So when the third child was born, we also cleared like 2 months of our life for him. And then he was born, we brought him home, and he was asleep, and there was one baby. And we didn't have to fight over who gets to do the twins. And kind of I had time on my hands all of a sudden. And we looked at each other. I actually remember that moment as Yav was like 4 days old. And I said, you know what? That's the time to go back to that story that when we were dated, you know, many, many, many years ago. And this is how I ended back to that story. So there's a little bit of romantic edge to it too. No one tell you the Talmud is not romantic. And I went back to this story, and I said, you know what, that's the time to deal with polemics as well. So Jewish-Christian relation, and here, this is where I'll end, is about both polemic and non-polemic relationship. And it's about minim stories, but also about monastic and dialoguing. And I think when we deal with this, my 2 books combined presented the bigger picture of Jewish-Christian relation, which is both polemic and non-polemic at the same time. So this is really what brought me to this topic. What about you, Ricky? What brought you to talk about rhetoric and the Greco-Roman and this great revelation of the Talmud being a scene, a really, really important scene of rabbinic engagement with rhetoric of the time.
So first I have to tell you about my first date with my wife, which is we had a major debate about what's more important, Tanakh or Talmud. And we almost didn't go out on the second date because of that.
I can see that with Esther, yep.
But I came up with mine because when I was working on my dissertation, first book, under Professor Schiffman, who I'm honored has joined us here today, I came upon a sugya that was relevant. My dissertation was about legal pluralism. When you have different opinions, for example, Rabban Gamliel in the very first Mishnah in Brachot, it says you can say Shema until sunrise. So my question was, did they actually practice what they preached, right? Or did they come to an agreement and vote majority? And you see a number of stories that most of the rabbis actually practiced what they said, their opinion. And what did the rabbis think about that? Was that okay, that there's pluralism and everybody's doing their own thing, or did they wish for uniformity? So the Talmud Yerushalmi on that Mishnah has a long sugya talking about Rabban Gamliel, and says, how could he practice his own opinion? He told his sons that they can say Shema after they came back from a party up until sunrise. How could they do that? And it brings a list of other sages who, even though they had their own opinions, they followed the opinion of the majority. I was reading that sugya, and something struck me about it, which was its structure. It starts off with a thesis and says, and how could he do that? And it says, we're going to bring examples from these three rabbis. And then it brings 3 paragraphs of discussion of each of those rabbis, and then has a conclusion. I said, this goes kind of like the 5-paragraph essay that we all learn in our freshman writing class. It's like, why is there a 5-paragraph essay in the Talmud? I've never seen anything like this. And so I wonder, where's our 5-paragraph essay come from? And I remember exactly where I was in the NYU library at the time. And so I went over, and I found Aristotle, his book on rhetoric. It comes right from the ancient world, the world that the rabbis knew and were living in. And even if they didn't read Aristotle or Cicero, but they would have experienced it just from hearing popular speakers, sophists come by, hearing the way lawyers speak. And so that just opened up for me this whole world of Greco-Roman rhetoric. The art of debating both sides of an issue. Well, that sounds kind of Talmudic. And so recognizing that the Talmud is situated in this broader environment. So of course, there's a few pages about this in Sol Lieberman's book and other places, but no one did a sustained study of it. And so the more I delved into it, the more it really opened up really a mystery, because the Talmud is so mysterious. There's no other work quite like it. Even in the ancient world, you can read Aristotle and Plato or other historians, are right. They write in full paragraphs and sentences. Nothing quite like the Talmud. And so when I came upon Greco-Roman rhetoric, I felt like it really puts the Talmud into context and solved a lot of questions that I always had. Okay, so you're next.
Oh, my turn. Oh, okay. Ricky, I see your library behind you, and I want to ask you, what's the closest book to your table? So what are the books that sits really close to your writing table that you're always reaching out to and that you chose to put right next to you? That's
okay, good. I'm going to reach out. It's right here. This is the book. It's the Encyclopedia Lechachmei HaTalmud VeHaGeonim. It's always next to me, because whenever I'm studying any piece of Talmud, and I want to know where and when did the sage live. This is not the most academic of all, so I'm a little embarrassed to bring it in front of you. I know you're gonna right there, but it's I
have a copy of it too. That's fine.
But it's the most useful. And and we'll give you little charts of their teachers and students, and so I always want to have that handy. And I guess it's something I learned from Professor Elman, and something I make sure my students always know all the generations and relationships of the students and teachers. How about you? What book is closest to you?
So actually, you're seeing my library, and but you're only seeing the full shelf. I came up with that question when we were preparing for this, but then when I thought of the answer, I'm gonna kind of cop out of that and answer that the truth is that I've been throwing books out of my library in recent years. I've decided to take books out because the truth is I use only digital books. I'm coming out here out of the closet and saying that I use digital readings, and I almost never ever use any of the books behind me. It was a really hard decision to make, and I have to tell you, getting rid of entire sets of books, and meaning, what do you mean getting rid? Giving it to my students, but still taking it out of the house and giving it away was a hard decision. But the truth is I haven't been using physical books for a while. And that decision, what to keep and what not to keep in the house, was a really crucial moment in my life. And the truth is I realized that my scholarship today is very much a scholarship that depended on the fact that I can't answer that question. And that my research is based on big data, on digital books being scanned, and that I have the option of searching all the books that are found in my computer because of OCR programs. The fact that I can look up very easily passages that I want to look and keywords. And the truth is, when I decided to go and study Christianity at Yale, I did my master courses at Yale. When you do a second master's, when you, I have a master's in Talmud from Hebrew U, but when I do my PhD at Yale, you do a master. I focused on Christian courses, Christian studies, and I did a lot of work in the divinity school at Yale, etc. When I told my professor at Hebrew U that, my Talmud professor, which I will not name, he said to me, he looked at me and he said, such a shame. There's no way a Jew would ever be able to say something new about Christianity. There's so much you're lacking. There's so much that you're missing that there's no way, why even bother? And you know what was very, very lucky? That I heard that before. When they told me a woman can never ever study Talmud because there's so much that you're lacking because you're only starting so late and you don't know the. I heard that before and I knew that not to be true. So I did not take that personally and did go and study Christianity. And the truth is, I could not have done my research today and used the years that I studied Christianity alone to do my research if I did not have the tools that have been developed in recent years in digital humanities and big data and search engines to do the work that I'm doing in Christianity. I'm dependent on that. The fact that I can research and the fact that I can read, millions of words in Christianity very easily and very fast, and be able to first find the source and then go look to where did I find that and what is this text and where does it come from, as opposed to the other way around, the way they used to do research in the past, is really the reason that I can do the work that I can do. So what's next to my computer? My computer. So what's next to my table? This one, yep, this, but in digital form, the concordance and all those stuff that are now found in big data research engines. So it's a little bit coping out of the question, but that's the truth.
Right. Yeah. I want to tell a story, if you don't mind, now that you brought that up. I mean, I'm also using digital more than ever, but there's two books in my library that are especially precious to me. This is Epstein's Mivaot. These books are not in print. And 12 years ago, I was at the World Congress for Jewish Studies at the book fair, and I happened to meet Menachem Katz. I just met him there. And I was like, is there anywhere I can buy these books? He said, no, they're out of print. And the next day, he came in with a shopping bag and put it next to me and ran away. And I opened the shopping bag and it's these two books. And I ran after him. I said, what is this? He said, this is from my father's library. I have my own copies already. And my father would have wanted someone, a scholar, to use them, someone who would really read them. And so he just gave them to me. And so these are two of the most precious possessions that I have. and always like to go and use them in print, even though they're also available digitally. But
That's
if I can,
beautiful.
but if I can ask you a question, you spoke about how having a broad knowledge was so important to your work. And I'm sure you know how many times any of us here, you're looking for a book in the library and you happen to see a book next to it that turns out to be so important, or you're flipping through a book and some other chapter besides the one you were looking for ends up being essential. So that kind of broad knowledge that you get from having a physical book and having to have actually, go through a physical copy, what are we in danger, and are students in danger of losing if you just do a Google search and only read that one sentence that you need? I don't know, how do you think it might change the nature of scholarship, and how can we, I guess, avoid that pitfall?
Exactly the opposite. You just described what search engines do, right? Search engines do, you Google a search, but then you get 10 other results that you didn't mean to do, and you just go off. You know how many times that happens to me? I go off in a different search. I do Google Books and I get to like 7 different other books. So that whole, romantic notion of sitting in the library and pulling out the book next to it, it's not one book, it's thousands of books in Google Books. Who needs to go and look for the actual book? I'm sorry, I'm totally bought into the search engine option. And I think for myself that I found this to be much more enriching than ever before. I'm sorry if I'm killing anyone's notion of a Talmud scholar that, needs the book and the smell of the book or whatever. I will say though, that when you talks about the story about Menachem Katz, which is a very moving story, I have to say that my grandmother's book still have the smell. She used to smoke very French cigarettes, and the smell of the cigarettes, I can't get rid of her books no matter what, because I need to like sniff them once in a while to remember her, because smelly wasn't the strongest. So I keep the books for the smells, but the truth is, for the academic knowledge, no way. Search engines that beat that every day. I'm sorry I'm answering this in such an enthusiastic way.
Okay, thank you. So let's get into a little bit of the content of our books, and you don't want to give away everything so that people will go and buy it. But maybe you could just share what's the significance overall of your project, and perhaps you can share one example with us.
Okay, so I did choose my romantic example, the one that started my book that I studied with Elitzur when we were very young, when 19. Let me just share my screen. Tell me if you can see this. Can you see this? My book, my book cover. Can everyone see it? Ricky?
Yes.
Ricky?
Yes, I can see it.
Can you see the book? Okay.
Yes.
So if you can see it, then it means that others can see it too, right? Okay.
Yes.
So basically, this is my book. I think the significance of the book is that I chose this very small corpus of minim stories. Minim are found in abundance in rabbinic literature, but the truth is about 92% of them is found in the Babylonian Talmud, so it's a very much a Babylonian Talmud literary phenomena. And within that corpus of minim stories in the Talmud, I chose a corpus of 5 stories of minim in the Talmud that share a very specific structure of a min coming in and asking a question of a rabbinic figure. I say rabbinic figure because there's one story with Uriah, which I'm going to choose now, so not a rabbi, but a rabbinic figure. A min asks a question, and it looks like a very, very stupid question. And then the rabbi or the rabbinic figure refutes that and shows how stupid that is. And most of the stories are very short, like minim stories. One of them is not so short, and that gave me an opportunity to elaborate in that book. But what intrigued me, and I think that's the significance of the book, is I try to show that those minim stories show acquaintance and willingness or need to deal with and dialogue with Christian tradition of the time of the Babylonian Talmud, or the composers of those Talmudic traditions, and that stories look stupid to us, or the question of the min looks stupid to us, or looks stupid to generations in between us and the composer of the text, because we're missing a piece of the puzzle. We're missing the way to read this correctly. And because of that, we don't understand what the story is meant to do. And I try to show that if we come armed with Christian tradition of the time, we can decipher what the story is all about, which actually shows a real dialogue with Christian tradition of the time. So that was what the book tried to do. The conclusion is that the rabbis and the Talmud knew much more than we give them credit about Christianity of the time. This was something that they were interested in, knew about, engaged with. And we have to look outside the Talmud for answers to better understand what they knew, what they tried to do, what they tried to tell us or the readers of their time, or whoever read these stories until today. And it tells us a piece of history about Jewish-Christian interaction, meaning Jews and Christians were much more in contact than we previously thought. They were polemicizing, but they were also debating and thinking if it's relevant or not relevant, if it's something that they can adopt, is it something that causes anxiety, is it something that they want to adopt. So these are all questions that they were discussing, and so this is what the book tries to do. And I basically try to promote the idea that we need to study more Christianity in order to understand the Talmud better. That's my conclusion. I always say that I feel like explorer of new lands, because we're just beginning to explore what the Talmud has to tell us about Jewish-Christian interaction, and so little work has been done on it, that there's so much potential and there's so much still to be done. So, this whole book is just about a few stories in the Talmud, and there's so much to do more about this and learn about what they knew and what kind of material they knew and what kind of engagement they had. So this is what the book tries to do. More than that, and this is something that I'll finish with, and then I'll give a short example. This book, I don't think there was ever a book in Talmud that quoted Stephen Colbert. And my book made me think about Stephen Colbert, because those Minim stories, and in general, polemic books in the Talmud, are books that make people, and this is the most frequent reaction I get to my stories, is just, this is so sophisticated, and you, the first one to get it after so many years, blah, blah, blah. Is it really possible? Because it's so sophisticated, people doubt that it's the true reading of the story. How can that be? How many people could have gotten it? It's so complicated, it's so sophisticated. How is it possible that the Talmud, who could have gotten it? Who's the audience? Who's the intended audience? And that made me think about humor, and British humor, to be exact. If we started with Agatha Christie, I want to talk about, Jane Austen and those snobbish humor. And what does humor mean? Is it just stand-up comedy that everyone can get? Is it Seinfeld? Or is it Stephen Colbert, which is the #1 late night show? But the host is someone, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he has very extensive knowledge of Catholicism and religious theology. And he makes sometimes jokes and references that are very highbrow, and you need really knowledge of it, but still manage to attract to be the #1 late night show host. Or Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, who makes, allusion to jokes, or who condescends someone in the audience, and that's enough for him that he's the only one who gets the joke and no one else gets it in the audience. So who, and going back from Colbert and Jane Austen to my Talmud, who gets it? Who was supposed to get it? Who was supposed to get the jokes about Christianity, those sophisticated jokes? How many people got it? So for me as an historian, it's enough that there was a composer of the text who understood it, who used those. But who are the intended audience? Is it an elite group that could get it? Is it a wider audience who can get some of it? Isn't it interesting? How many people knew enough about Christianity to understand that? How many people were that? So these are questions that interest me and kind of correlate with a lot of the things that I'm thinking about these days. I'm just telling you that my new book borrows from Nate Silver's election stuff. So I'm using contemporary stuff to understand the Talmud better, which I'm a strong in favor of. But I'm just saying that these are questions that are interesting to me. And I want to think about that with you when I use my next 5 minutes to talk about an example from the Talmud, which is this story from Brachot. This is in Hebrew, but I'll translate to English. This mean, by the way, mean is a word that's very hard to translate, which led to this very, very good scholarly practice to translate mean as M-I-N. No need to translate, we'll just use the word mean, which I find abhorrent, honestly, because this is coping out of the real challenge of translating what mean is supposed to mean, and I'm mean supposed to mean. It only works when I talk about this in English, not in Hebrew. But when mean is supposed to mean, and I think it's supposed to mean a heretic, and this is a claim that I'm trying to make in my book. I go back to the use of heresy, and you're welcome to see in my book why I choose to do that. But in any case, for this, the purpose of this lecture, a mean comes to Bruria and talks to her and says to her, Ktiv oni akara lo yalada, rejoice, akara, barren one who had no children. I'm translating literally. And he says to her, because she did not have any children, she should rejoice. And she says to him, you fool, read to the end of the verse. It says, because at the end of time, the sons of the Shomema, the desolate, will be more than the sons of the Be'ula. Literally the one that has a husband or the one. But she says, rejoice, Knesset Israel, the synagogue of Israel, that is like a woman who is an akara, who did not have someone who could not bear children, who did not have children to Gehinnom. And some manuscripts said, like you. Now, this is a good example of what my book, the genre of book, of the mini corpus that I try to examine. Look, he's asking a stupid question, foolish question, I should say, like Bulia calls him, because it's a, read to the end of the verse. Why should she rejoice? Because she'll have more sons. Just read it till the end. What is this about? And again, I'm asking you my Colbert question, my Jane Austen question. What's the point? This was composed, whenever the Talmud was composed, 5th century, 4th century, 6th century, who knows? And we're reading this now in the 21st century, and we're reading a stupid question, a stupid story about someone who was foolish enough to ask a question that is easily refutable. Just read until the end of the verse. What is this about? And that was what intrigued me when I was reading these stories. And basically what I try to claim is that it looks stupid to us or foolish to us because we don't understand the background to it. I don't have time to go into that, but the key to this for me is the verse in Isaiah that this is all about, rejoice, roni akara lo yalada. And I think this, the key to it is the interpretation of these verse over the years, which basically focus on the fact that this verse has 3 adjectives that are not antonym to one another. Akara, shomema, and beula, which are not opposites to one another, even though the verse present them as such. Akara literally means someone who had no children. Shomema is desolate, which is not necessarily the same. And beula means someone who had a husband or someone who is not a virgin, right? This is a few options. And what happened during the centuries that this verse was translated, for example, in Targum Yonatan, in the Targums, each interpreters of this verse or translator took one of those adjectives and made this the focus of it. So, for example, the Jonathan took, Targum Yonatan took the word shomema, right, the desolate one, it's a dita, and made it into Jerusalem versus Rome. Rome who was inhabited versus Jerusalem who was not. So to take that and understand the whole verse around that. What I try to show in this book, and what actually it's an article that Nitzur and I both wrote together based on that first day to a book, a festschrift in honor of my professor Stephen Frad, and published in his festschrift, and then later in the book made into a chapter. We try to say we use Philo as our base. To understand, Philo takes a very interesting move when he reads this in 2 layers. I don't have time to go into that, but he uses the verse, he uses the analogy to talk about a virgin versus someone who's no longer a virgin, someone who had intercourse, which is very, very interesting in the verse. And we try to show that actually Philo understood the word be'ula the way it's used in rabbinic literature, in later Hebrew, which means someone like modern Hebrew, by the way, be'ula, which means someone who is no longer a virgin. It's not the meaning in biblical Hebrew, but in the time of Philo, in rabbinic literature, at least, that's the meaning that we find, that the rabbis read the word be'ula, the biblical Hebrew, in that meaning. And we try to show, which has ramification to, did Philo understand Hebrew or not? I'm not going to go into that. But we think that Philo understood be'ula really to mean a non-virgin, which leads to Paul. And Paul in Galatians, a very, very famous passage in Galatians, where, and very difficult passages to understand, use the same Isaiah verse to talk about Jerusalem of above and Jerusalem of below, and talks about 2 women, Sarah and Hagar. And he calls one that had a son born to Abraham by the flesh, katasarka, and one by the promise, and that's Isaac. And he talks about Sarah and Hagar as two women, as a metaphor, as figuratively, allegorically. One of the times when he actually used allegoria as the word to describe this, as two women representing Jerusalem of above and Jerusalem of below. The problem is that if you go to Isaiah, there's a woman, the woman that has a husband is Hagar. And she's the one that has less children in the future than someone that doesn't have a husband, right? Which is Sarah. And that's exactly the opposite, right? The real wife of Abraham was actually Sarah. So that's a question that scholars of Paul and the letters to the Galatians struggle with. And we basically try to show that we think that Paul read Isaiah verse like Philo, and when he read Beula to mean a non-virgin. So Hagar had a child by the flesh, meaning by sexual relation, as opposed to Isaac that was born by the promise, non-sexually, which goes along hand in hand with rabbinic midrash that talks about Isaac being born because Sarah no longer was menstruating, and we have a midrashim that talk about Isaac being born, miraculously. All this brings me back to my brachot and bringing back that interpretation. And really, you should do justice to my interpretation more than those 10 minutes and go back and read really the long way to get to it. But basically what I try to show that this argument between the mean and Buria is based on this Christian interpretation of Roni Akara as an opposite and an antonym of Be'ula. And Akara does not mean someone who had no children, but someone who is a virgin, as opposed to Be'ula, who's someone who's no longer a virgin. And if you read the Isaiah verse like Paul did, and like Philo did, and this is like Christian interpretation, a famous virgin, and who uses this verse in this way, is obviously Mary, giving birth to Jesus. And if you read the verse and in this way, I try to claim that we should read this as an argument. Does this verse talk about Christians versus Jews, about the children of the virgin? Roni akara lo yalada mishum de akara Roni, because she's a virgin, she should rejoice. It's no longer a stupid question of someone who couldn't read the verse until the end. This is a theological debate. Are the children of the virgin the one that should rejoice, or the children of someone who's came not from the virgin, the two women? And when Boaz says to him, read until the end of the verse, this is not about the virgin, this is about the desolate, this is about Jerusalem, and we are the one who are going to win at the end of the day. And then she says, Roni Akara, Roni Knesset Israel, we should rejoice and not having children like you to go to Gehenom. And that's a real Jewish Christian interpretation. I'm going to stop here and give Ricky a chance to give an example as well from his book. But this is just an example of how Christian interpretation and illuminate and show us the background of a Talmudic passage, which is what I try to do in the book. Ricky, your turn.
Thank you so much, Michal. Really so fascinating. We don't have too much time left, so I'll do a short example because I do want to leave some time for questions. So everybody can think about and prepare questions as I'm talking. So here's my quick example that I'll share, and then I'll talk about some of the more significance of what I think it means. Okay, so here's a typical Bavli sugya. It's a tashma sugya. So this is just one example. Starts off with Mishnah, which gives the basic law. How many lugim of wine are you allowed to donate to the Bet HaMikdash in certain numbers? And then the Talmud starts with a theoretical case. Is it a fixed amount, or can I give any amount? And then they'll break it down according to what is according to the fixed amounts. Or do I have to give the exact amount that's prescribed? That's the question. And so there are two opinions, Abaye and Rava. And the Talmud continues with Tashema. Let's bring one source. Is that a proof for? No, not necessarily. And then it's proof against the other side. Rav asks, is that a proof? And we say, no, not necessarily. And we continue going on, and sometimes it goes on for many steps, and sometimes not so much, and it ends with teku. Okay, good. So this is everybody knows this type of sugya. Well, I was surprised to see that a very similar format we can find in Greco-Roman school books, where if you were, a boy and rich enough to go past grammar school, you would learn the art of debate, the art of rhetoric. And one of the exercises, and we have written versions of these exercises, was precisely this. The student would be presented with a law, and then a theoretical case, and then they would be tasked, here, write an argument against or for each one. In this case, Quintilian, very famous teacher of rhetoric, made a summary of the different arguments that other orators had made. So here's the example. The law is that a priest has the power to release someone from punishment, right? He can pardon someone. Also, let's say that it's lawful to kill an adulterer. If the husband finds his wife in adultery in the middle, he can take the law into his own hands. Well, now the case is a man, the husband, caught a priest in adultery with his wife, and then the priest says, I pardon myself. And the husband goes and kills him anyway. So the husband is charged with murder. So is that considered murder? Or was the priest allowed to pardon himself? And so it starts with a discussion and then a declamation, an oration, in this case, only one side. In other cases, like Seneca, he has a similar law, theoretical case, and then gives examples on this side, quoting many different people, and then the other side, quoting many different people. So I think you can see that the similarity is quite amazing. But whenever we're doing comparative work, I think we always want to think about the difference as well, because the rabbis are not simply, borrowing blindly. They see that learning this art of reason is important, especially if you're going to go into a career in law. But one difference is that whereas the in Greco-Roman system was adversarial, and so they'll have lawyers, and you want to train to be a lawyer so that whoever hires you, you can argue. The rabbis do not allow lawyers in their court system, but rather a judge has to have this skill in order to be able to see through arguments or anything that the witnesses or litigants might be saying. That's one difference. Another is that whereas the declamation tries to prove one side is right and the other side is wrong, a tashma sugya, as you know, is always trying to show that both sides can stand up. Right? A successful tashma sugya says that both Abaye and Rava can reconcile their opinion with all of the baraitat and all of the types of reasoning. So when you end with teku, that we leave it standing, that's not a failure, but rather a celebration that we were able to hold up all both sides. So I see here something that's really significant in times of the rabbis as well as today, which is that the rabbis were in a world where they were confronted with two opposites. One is the view that there is no truth out there, everything is fake news, and the best argument is going to win out. And that was the view of the sophists. And on the other side, you had people that believed in absolute one truth, whether it be philosophers or sectarians. And we have Professor Baumgarten is here, and Professor Mason is here, people that I've learned so much about this. And each, the Dead Sea sect saying, our interpretation is right, everyone else is wrong, and one day we'll have a big war and destroy everyone else. And neither of these extremes is a good system. And we see that playing out today. The rabbis look around them and they say, can we find a middle path, the best perhaps of both worlds, which is that we do believe in the prophetic divine truth of the Torah, but we also recognize, and so that's like the biblical civilization, but we also recognize that the reason, human interpretation, plays a big role. And so they allow for multiple interpretations that can live side by side. And although Bet Shammai strongly believes his is the right way, he can also find a way to live with, to eat with, to marry the children of Bet Hillel. Of course, there are limitations, and that gets to you, Michal, right? Not every interpretation can be accepted. And so I'll end with this analogy. I think of the ancient world kind of like a big particle collider, and taking these different things, smashing them together and see what comes out. And some things only last for a short time, but other times you create new elements that weren't there before that do last. So I think when the biblical tradition met with Hellenism, that Alexander the Great meeting the Kohen Gadol, what is that going to produce? These two great thought traditions, and one thing it creates is Christianity, and the other thing that comes out of it is the rabbis in the Talmud that I think are successful, and well, their success is proof of the fact that we're still here studying Talmud and gaining new insight and new depth. So thank you, Michal. And I'd love to open up to anyone who has any questions, insights. I can't necessarily see whoever is you're raising your hand, but you can unmute and share what you think.
Can I ask what the difference would be if the person would have found someone else adulterating with his wife, and then the priest absolved that guy? Like, why does it matter if the priest himself was the one doing it?
Right. I mean, so yeah. Just to give an example, without getting too political, can Trump, can our president pardon himself for some crime that he did? That will have to go to Supreme Court. But that's the idea. The priest is now sinning. So does he retain his status as a priest even though he is now sinning and he can pardon himself, or does the act of sinning remove that label of priest, and so he is no longer able to? So it's kind of a paradox.
No, but my question was, like, why does it matter if it's the priest himself, right? If you have the rule that a priest can absolve someone from sin, right? So then it's as if nothing ever happened, right? So then why can the husband just go murder someone?
Well, in this case, the priest is the one sinning with his wife. So
I know, but I'm saying, say with someone else, like, why does it matter? The priest absolved. Like, let's say it was a different priest that absolved him. Like,
that would be okay. If his friend came and absolved him, then the husband would not be allowed to murder.
Okay.
Right.
Given what you've suggested, and thank you both very much, translating this pedagogically, what would you do with this in terms of teaching Talmud to high school students, maybe in some yeshiva settings, whether that's men or women? How do you balance it? What would you tell someone who's teaching Talmud to these populations in order to integrate the type of knowledge that you've shared with us today?
Michal, go for it.
I think that's a wonderful question. And I have to tell you, my kids go to this special program called Ofek in Jerusalem, and last week the new principal of this Ofek, it's like for gifted kids, whatever, and he sent a program of additional lectures in the evening, and obviously he sent a program with 8 speakers. Guess how many women out of the 8? None. I got very upset, and I wrote him an email, and right away, volunteered 8 of my friends, and he came out with a new program with half and half women, half men. I was very happy and very upset that I still have to do this in this day and age. But obviously, because of that, I now have to give a lecture, and it's going to be the first time that I'm going to give a lecture to 3rd graders. And I started thinking about how I'm going to talk about my research, which I want to introduce to them, Jewish Christian, to 3rd graders. And that's I have to tell you, I'm working so hard on this lecture, more than I work on any of my other lecture, because it's very hard to do that and all of this assumption and what to do. But I think it's very, very important to do so. I have to say, I am a very, very strong believer that you should study Talmud from the beginning using the outside world from the get-go. I do this when I teach my kids, Bible. So much more so when we do this with rabbinic literature. And I am a strong believer that this has to be tools that are brought. When people ask me, how do you deal with the fact that you lack all this, information that men get from, Girseta de Enkuta. I don't know how to translate Girseta de Enkuta into English, but the things that you learn from when you're a child, which women don't, and women like myself don't have. And how do you catch up to the gap? And I always say, you work hard, but the truth is, I'm kind of happy about that gap. Because when I started studying Talmud, I started, I think, the right way. Because I studied from the beginning with that book that Ricky showed that talks about generation of the rabbi. Each rabbi that I encountered for the first time, I talked about generation and who was his, what's the surrounding and the timetable, etc. From the beginning, I learned about layers in the Talmud. This is how I learned. I didn't have to correct any misunderstanding about the Talmud. So there's something I think that gives me an edge to someone that learned it the wrong way or a different way and had to correct it over time. So there's something good about learning from the beginning in the right way. Taking this to our new generation of girls and boys that now get introduced to study the Talmud, and I am a strong believer that they have to learn this in light the Talmud in light of its time, or rabbinic literature in light of the time, from the beginning, with source criticism, with critical thinking, with critical tools, and rhetoric, and orality, and cultural studies, and archaeology from the beginning. So I'm a really, really strong believer in that. How I'm going to do that with third graders, that's a hard one. I don't have an answer yet, but I think I will have to. So.
Yeah, I agree, Michal. Even though we call this academics and, as if it's very advanced, sometimes it's really the most very basic questions that any beginner, can appreciate. Hey, here's a manuscript. Let's compare them, or give a story, a historical background. And I think it actually makes it easier, not harder. So I think academics can be a great tool, obviously translated for a classroom and age appropriate. And all that, but it can, I think, bring Talmud to life and to make it a lot more interesting and understandable.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
First of all, congratulations. How are you? How are you, everyone? Congratulations.
By the way, I studied with the daughter of Professor Schiffman in that first year in that Midrashah in Lindenbaum. We were together, not Lindenbaum, in Matan, together. Right, and Professor Schiffman came to give us a talk. That was the first time I heard about Zdokim and Kum, etc.
But I don't know if I should ask you what the talk was about, because the talk.
I can tell you exactly what it was about 20 years ago.
Good. Okay. So anyhow, I just want to say something which is sort of a side issue here. Menachem Katz gave you the Mavol Nusach HaMishnah, so everybody has to know who Menachem Katz's father was. Menachem Katz's father was the Rav of Beersheba. But originally, he was the Rav of Bratislava. And in Bratislava, when he left Bratislava, he came to Beersheba. In Bratislava, he had published a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, a little book giving an interpretation of the word, it's funny word in the rule of the community, hu, and then a second aleph, hey. And we know you have that hua thing, but it was a second aleph. Anyhow, he had his whole Zoharic theory. It's never going to stand up anywhere. But he was a great Jewish leader in a time under communism that was very difficult. And he came to Beersheba, and a funny thing happened that the university invited Professor Siegal, who was then in California, who had lived also in Bratislava, and was a great Semitist who studied Ugaritic and Semitic languages. And he got off of the Sheirut in Beersheba, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Take me to the chief rabbi." They had been friends in Bratislava, and everybody should know that Bratislava is Pressburg. When the Chafetz Chaim came, they changed the name. So you now have, right, the books from a very great man, and so you should know that it's not a nobody. It's very interesting that to have books from some of these people. Sometimes there's a continuity in it. It's just I thought I should just tell this little nice story. And maybe eventually this will become a ma'aseh that somebody will do a study on 500 years from now. But anyhow, again, congratulations to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And congratulations to President
By the way, who's your grandmother? Wait a minute. Michal.
Suzanne Daniel Nataf.
Ah, okay.
She was she translated Philo into Hebrew. That's her. The edition in Hebrew in Mossad Bialik, that's hers.
Yes,
So
I
she-
think I
she
only have
was a-
one volume of it. By the way, you can see behind. I'm not getting rid of any books. I can't work without books. When I'm away somewhere and I have to work the other way, it's just not possible.
You know how many times I told
if I were
Stephen,
Talmudic,
you know how many times I told Stephen Fry to get rid of his copies of journals, actual paper copies
oh,
of
that's
journals
true.
in his
Most of
office?
my journals are in the garage. I try to give them away. Anybody
Can't
here
get them.
who wants all SBLs and all JBLs, all these things, let me know. You can come to my garage and get them. And really, it's no joke. I tried to get rid of them. They can't get rid of them.
Can't
We
get
may eventually have no choice to give them, throw them in the garbage, but it's very sad.
Congratulations to Professor Shipman on the Festschrift that just came out in his honor. So everybody
you.
pick up a copy. Very good
Thank
article.
you very much, and thank you for your article.
Well deserved.
Thank
And speaking of students, I'll call upon one of my students, Audrey.
I'm not sure how much of this question is related to the subject matter.
We can't hear
Can't
you.
hear you, Audrey. Can't hear you.
Audrey, just
Audrey,
unmute.
can you unmute yourself?
Yes. It's a question directed toward Michal, and I don't know how much it's related to the subject matter, but I wanted to ask, do you think that your faith in God and in Judaism increased with such an extensive study of the Talmud?
Increased.
Yes.
Wow, that's a personal question. I think my relationship to my faith became more nuanced and refined and different. It definitely had an effect on mine and my family's life in relation to my religion. I think I became much more aware, and this is how I teach my kids. I think it was much more knowledge-based rather than intuition-based, much more
Rational?
I would say critical thinking, and I think I understood much more how human the sources are and how complicated and beautiful they can be. I think I will leave it at that at this point. But I think my faith or my religious world has definitely morphed and changed because of the contact with the sources. And I think it cannot not change once you get close to the sources, especially when you're raised like me, when the access to the sources were given to me very, very late in my life. So the discovery of the sources really made a difference in how I relate to my Judaism and how I raise my kids now. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Miriam.
Thank you so much, both of you. This was an illuminating talk. I have a question directed towards Dr. Barashar Siegal, although I think it's relevant to both of you. And this is about the context of the text that you're working with. Of course, your work very much centers on the Christian context, but I'm curious, how do you balance the context of the redaction of the Bavli as opposed to the stories that are the context of the stories that are taking place? Because I imagine that a lot of these Minim stories are actually about much earlier rabbis, specifically Tanaim and Roman Palestine. So how, maybe that's not true, I'm not sure, but I'm curious how you balance that sort of the historical context of the characters in the story versus the redaction of the text.
Such a wonderful question. Come study with me at Ben-Gurion. You're invited right away. I'm stealing her right away. Wonderful question. You should definitely pursue in this direction in the future. I see a Talmud scholar in the making here. I think
she's my PhD student, and I told her that she should take your course next semester from Zoom.
Wonderful. Such a gift for you, Ricky, and to you, Miriam, to study with Ricky. But I think it's a wonderful question. I'll answer very shortly. I actually disagree. I think the stories are, you're right, by the way, out of all the Minim stories in the Talmud, they're almost always about Tanaitic sources, Tanaitic rabbis, and placed in Palestine. But I think that's a literary fiction. And I think they tell us actually about Babylonian background in the time of the either composition of the sources during the Talmudic time, or even later in the redaction time, meaning pushing it towards 5th, 6th century. And especially when we talk about Christianity, and we're talking about, I actually can prove it in one source, that even though the story is about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the story shows familiarity with 4th and 5th century Christian debate about the Holy Spirit, which did not exist earlier than that, which makes my example super cool, because it's the one time where I can show they could not have known this before that. So that's actually a terminus ad quam, right? This is where it has to, like, you know, it has to be late. And I can show that these stories, and I think these are literary fiction specifically made to look like that. They're not supposed to project at all early Tanaic time, but they actually tell us about a history. So when you talk about history in the Talmud of Jewish-Christian interaction, it's not about what the text tells about, but the tradition that they reflect can tell us about history, but the history of the later period of the time of the composition of those traditions and not the earlier ones. So this is one of the revelation of this book that I try to push toward, to say, this is about 4th, 5th, 6th century Babylonia and Jewish-Christian interaction then, and not about what the stories are supposedly about. And I think the Bavli does this on purpose. On purpose, it projects about earlier time. And in Palestine, it's saying, oh, this is but it's about, actually can teach us as a scholar about the later period, which is much more interesting for me, because we don't know much about Jewish-Christian interaction in that time period. And it's much more intriguing because it's Eastern Christianity in that time period, etc. So it's a wonderful question. And I actually really think that this is one of the things that I have new to bring to the table, which talks about literary tradition and not historical tradition. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'll just take one last question because we're pretty much out of time. Melech, good to see you again. I remember I was in your home for Shabbat
Yes.
some years ago.
Yes, I've read your work. It's very enjoyable, and I just ordered a copy of Michal's book through interlibrary loan, so I'm looking forward to reading it. And I really enjoyed this discussion. So the question that I have is this: a lot of the events and the protagonists in the Talmud and the Mishnah are from Greco-Roman and Zoroastrian times, but the rabbis continue to have an impact on us and on our relationship with other peoples and cultures. In particular, I'm thinking of India. I'm from India. And not that long ago, there was a Siegal controversy. So how would you suggest that, or would you suggest that, you know, when we read the Talmud, this for both of you, Talmud, we should keep in mind the context in which all those discussions occurred? And by the way, another question that to me is also personally very, very important is anti-Black racism in the Talmud. So should we, when we read the Talmud, how can we how can we bring the context in which those things were discussed and written, and said, and how we should relate to them today when we have all these other groups that the rabbis didn't have any knowledge about?
Michal, you want to talk about your meeting with the Pope?
I can talk about my meeting with the Pope. I usually try to steer far, far away from modern time discussion, especially when it comes to feminism, for example, or other stuff. It's too complicated to bring into the picture, and so I stay way back in the past. But the truth is, it has direct relevance to the world we live in. You're completely right, and I think it has to be brought into the picture. And even though I try to be coy about it in my classroom, I think it's very evident when I talk about. And this led me really to when our previous head of university, Rivka Karmi, called me up and said, "Do you want to come meet the Pope?" And I said, "Really, you're seriously asking?" Of course I want to meet the Pope. And it was the good Pope, the one that's the current Pope. And we, more than meeting with him, we actually met with cardinals. We had a few days meeting in the Vatican, which was more important, work meetings with Vaticans that deal with Jewish-Christian interactions. And it was amazing talking about and realizing what the Vatican is going through now in Jewish-Christian relations. There's so much work to be done. It was interesting to see that when we talked about Beersheba, they said, really, they thought you knew about camels there and not more than that. And I had to explain that there's a city and a university and where I teach. But it was very, very interesting. And I'm actually working now on a project about conservative rabbis in the 50s, JTS graduate, and their relationship with Christian leaders of their time. So I definitely see a connection. I think there's a lot to be learned. And especially, I think it's a good note to end this discussion on it. I think Ricky and I are part of a trend in our lives, as well as in our research, that try to show the complexity of rabbinic sources, which we sometimes live in a world where they're flattened, and flattening sources is never a good thing. So the beauty of rabbinic sources is their complexity. And the reason I fell in love with them is the fact that they're so surprising. They're always surprising, and they're never what you expect them to be. And even when you talk about Jewish-Christian relation, they're never what you expect them to be. They take central theological theme of Christians and adopt them heartedly. And they polemicize about things, and they're very anxious about other things which you didn't think that they would be. And because human beings and religions in contact and people in contact are complex, like we live in the world today. And for some reason, when we look in the past, we look at them as simple and uncomplex. And of course they were complex, just like us. And if they were open to these kinds of discussion, if they were open to talking and dialoguing and absorbing and contacting, why are we so hesitant to do the same and acknowledge that and be aware of the world we live in? It doesn't mean we have to be less Jewishy. It just means that our Judaism can be much more complex and interesting and in dialogue. And I'm a firm believer in that. And it brings me great joy to understand that the sources that we get inspired by can inspire this in our lives today. So that's where I'm at.
Michal, you said that so eloquently, and certainly the Talmudic rabbis were not ones to simplify any matters, and matters of truth and interpretation and justice and tolerance were, I think, all at the forefront of their minds, and we have so much to learn from their wisdom. So thank you, Michal, for joining us all the way from Israel. Thank you to everyone who helped organize, Steve Fine, Ronnie Perelis, and everyone who came and joined today. Thank you so much, and I wish you Chodesh Tov.
Thank you, Ricky, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, and familiar faces and unfamiliar faces and students, and I'm so grateful for the hospitality. And again, it doesn't exempt you from inviting me physically when we can.
We owe you a plane ticket.
Good to see you all. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Chodesh Tov. It's wonderful.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.